Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Dunstan Thomas webinar that today turns to the SIPP market, and in particular will address the growing appeal of SIPPs, stemming from both the flexibility and tax efficiencies they offer in decumulation. I'm Adrian Boulding, Director of Retirement Strategy here at Dunstan Thomas, and I will be chair for today's webinar. We will be live for the next hour, finishing at 1 o'clock promptly, as I know many of you have other meetings to get to. As in our previous webinars, we've assembled a panel of experts from around the industry who will offer some introductory remarks before addressing your questions. And our panel today consists of Chris Jones, who is principal at Trott Consultancy, a chartered taxation practitioner with a technical and advisory background, now specializing in SIPPs and the SIPP marketplace. He worked for 12 years with an accountancy practice, giving individual and corporate advice on financial and tax planning, including SAS and other pensions. Chris has been involved with SIPPs since their foundation in 1990, working in a consultancy capacity with a range of financial services companies before becoming a director at Suffolk Life, where he was responsible for development of strategic partnerships and oversaw the acquisition of 5 books of SIPP business from other providers. Chris now works with a range of clients on SIPP market, regulatory, legal and technical matters, including product development and management, the impact of the FCA's thematic reviews, due diligence, capital adequacy and other market developments. And he is also the founder of DD Hub Limited, that makes investment manager due diligence readily available. Our second panelist will be Claire Trott, chair of AMPS and head of pension strategy at Technical Connection. Claire has over 20 years of experience in the pensions industry. Her career has ranged from being a financial advisor dealing with pension transfers to helping advisors deal with the complexities of SIPPs and SASs in a post-simplification environment. In addition to the day job, Claire is chairperson of the Association of Member-Directed Pension Schemes, or AMPS as we fondly call it, the trade association for SIPP and SAS providers. Claire's role with Technical Connection continues to build on her ability to communicate with various audiences using a wide array of media. And our third panelist is going to be Rennie Biggins, who is head of retirement at Tizer. Rennie has been at Tizer for over 4 years and is their head of retirement. He's been in the industry for 30 years and has held various senior management positions at organizations ranging from large mutual life and pensions company, a bespoke SIPP provider, an IFA, a platform technology provider. Qualifications-wise, he holds the CII accreditations of Certificate in Life and Pensions, Certificate in Financial Planning, and Diploma in Financial Planning. Now, to set today's webinar in context, I'd like just to reflect on the phenomenal growth of the SIPP market over the last 20 years. And if you want to know anything about the SIPP market, without doubt, the best place to go is Mr. SIPP himself, John Murray, principal at the consultancy More to SIPPs. And John has kindly sent me this slide specifically for today's webinar. So bear with me, I will just produce the slide John has shown me. Growing faster than a wave of COVID cases, today we have almost 3 million SIPP plans and assets of £436 billion. Around 2/3 of customers have a financial advisor, and here the average case size is £180,000. For the non-advised customers, case sizes are smaller and average just under 100,000. The lion's share of the growth in the last 10 years has been in SIPPs that sit on platform, and we're now seeing a fresh growth area in fintech SIPPs such as Pensions B, Moneybox and Penfold. John predicts that by the end of next year, we will see SIPP assets exceed £500 billion, and that's based on current share prices. So any further post-COVID recovery in stock markets will simply boost that further. A number of new entrants and existing providers are increasingly focusing on the decumulation market. Maybe they're adopting follow the money as their mantra, as John Murray estimates that over 60% of SIPP assets are yet to vest. It's an exciting market, but just before I hand over to our first speaker, I will stop sharing the slide and return back to normal and draw your attention to the Ask a Question button that you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can use this button both to pose questions for our panel, but also you can use the button to see the questions that other delegates have asked. And importantly, you can vote for the question you would most like to see answered today. I'm going to move us over now to our first speaker, that is Chris Jones.
Adrian, good afternoon, and good afternoon all. Thanks so much for that great introduction, Adrian. And great to see those slides, the slide from John. It showed a very steady increase in the SIPP market, exactly what I expected. John follows the market closely, as I do, and the market is very buoyant. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. But as Adrian's mentioned, I've been involved with SIPPs since the very beginning, so I've watched them grow from a very niche product for the high-end customers into now what is a mass market product for a huge number of customers. And SIPP sales are buoyant. The latest figures from the FCA show that in Q1 this year, 215,000 SIPPs were sold across the industry. 2020, for obvious reasons, was not such a good year, but it looked, we had a strong rebound this year, and I think that quite probably this year we're going to see a continuation of the sort of figures we've seen over the last 5 years or so. So the SIPP market is in very good shape. But what I find interesting is that when I started out, SIPPs were very much this niche product for the high-end customers, entirely advisor-focused and advisor-driven. But over the last 8 years or so, increasingly, direct-to-consumer SIPPs have taken the market. And now, astonishingly, for those of us who think of SIPPs as an advisor-driven product, astonishingly, 4 out of every 5 SIPPs, or certainly 3 out of every 4 SIPPs sold are direct-to-consumer with no advisor involved, according to the FCA figures. So I think that lays down a challenge for providers that we need to be better at providing support information to end consumers to help them in their journey, particularly on this topic today around decumulation. The rules are very flexible, they're also very complex. So we need to hold our clients' hands better, I think, and support them. And we could do with some help from the FCA on that, because things like producing illustrations which focus on one retirement date, I think, are really unhelpful. What would be much more helpful is help people understand that this is a pot which doesn't have to be crystallized at one particular point, but could be drawn on over a number of years in different branches. So a lot to do there. Language is important. I just used that awful word, crystallized. We've got to find better terms for describing the pots and the benefit pots and the accumulation pots that people have. And I'm particularly keen also to see providers give more or deliver more flexibility to end customers. I think customers are going to be looking increasingly for much more online, immediate access to funds once they are in a post-retirement environment. And no doubt we can talk about that more in the questions.
William, thanks, Chris. I'm going to go straight to our second speaker. That's Claire Trott.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll just follow on a little bit from what Chris was saying about the numbers. I think it's very difficult to get the numbers from the FCA as to who's what's a SIPP, as they changed the definition when SIPPs were sort of became more mainstream, and anything that has a self-investment option, which is more than one fund, is basically classed as a SIPP. So it's very difficult to get those figures, but I do agree with Chris that there's definitely a drive for people to take charge and to invest themselves and make those decisions within the more flexible environment of the SIPP that we've seen that over the last few years. But I think the bigger picture regarding the flexibility of SIPPs and flexibility of retirement is the holistic way that they can be used. And I think we really need to stop thinking about a pension pot for retirement. I think we need to start thinking more about holistic planning, because once you factor in the benefits of holding the money within a SIPP for IHT planning, for tax relief up front, and protecting your beneficiaries in the long run, pensions can be something that actually is one of the last things that you might touch. And factoring all of that into, if I've got a broad range of other investments, where should I be taking it from? That education piece that Chris talked about, as pensions are not just for retirement. You might want to use some of your ISAs for retirement or unit trusts, and making use of all the different tax reliefs that you can get within the year. It's over £20,000 that you can take out tax free from a variety of different areas, and I think that's something that people really need to consider, rather than thinking about their pot just for retirement. And just talking about some of those taxes, I think it's really important. We have a lot of focus on tax, which in my world that makes sense, but we are seeing a lot of things in the press that are going direct to consumer that are driving behaviours. So the negatives around the lifetime allowance, we need to remind people it's an allowance. We need to remind people that they shouldn't be driving the crystallization, there's that word again, of taking money out and bringing money into their estate because of the lifetime allowance. That's a real big educational piece for me that I think is coming across wrong in maybe some of the national press, that people who don't understand the implications of doing that and the knock-on effect it has to other things. So the flexibility within pensions, taken with everything else that's going on in the world of finance, is brilliant. But as Chris said, I think education to ensure people are utilising them to their max is really, really important.
Thank you, Claire, very much. And I'm going to move us over to our third speaker today. That is Rennie Biggins from Tizer. Rennie, over to you.
Thank you, Odin. Good afternoon, everyone. From a regulatory perspective, we've had and continue to see an endless stream of consultations and interventions put in place, often designed primarily to protect the non-advised.
Rennie, I think we've lost you.
Consequences and challenges. And with the focus of today being on SIPPs and decumulation, I thought a good intervention to briefly look at is investment pathways, which came into existence from February this year. So they stemmed from the FCA's Retirement Outcomes Review, and that found that a third of non-advised drawdown customers were invested in cash or cash-like assets. So very quickly, the requirements were for a non-advised person entering drawdown, they need to be shown 4 investment pathway objectives. 1, I have no plans to touch my money in the next 5 years. 2, I plan to use my money to set up a guaranteed income within the next 5 years. 3, I plan to start taking my money as a long-term income within the next 5 years. And 4,
we're having some bandwidth problems with you, Rennie. I'm going to suggest you drop the camera because that often solves the bandwidth.
Okay.
Okay, well, while Rennie is dropping the camera, I'm going to take us on to questions. The questions are coming in. That is brilliant. The first one said the screen shared slide didn't work. I apologize for that. It worked in the dress rehearsal, but it didn't want to work today. So sorry about that one. Other questions that are coming in are, we have a question, what is the tax efficiencies? What are the key tax efficiencies to consider when SIPP holders are beginning decumulation? Who would like to answer that one?
I mentioned tax, Adrian, so I should probably take that one. Well, I think it's important to consider one, should you be drawing from your SIPP in the first place? Or have you got other assets that are more tax efficient to draw from? You need to take account of things like your personal allowance and factoring that in. And for me, tax-free cash, unless you have a real purpose for it, is actually a really good way to manage the amount of income tax you're paying within a year. So you can take a little bit of tax-free cash, a little bit of taxed income, and you can get, just shy of 20 grand, so probably about 16,000 that you can take out without paying any tax at all. And you can then sort of take a bit from your ISAs to top that up, and just making sure you're utilizing your allowances. And the other bonus of doing that is, again, we're just crystallizing, back to that word again, we may just be crystallizing a small amount, which gives us chance for continued growth and maybe some extra tax-free cash. We might get out the other side of this frozen lifetime allowance as well, and all those sort of things. So I just think we just shouldn't be drawn to having to do everything in one go, which is the real benefit of SIPPs, because they're at the forefront of any changes that become available. If you look at an occupational scheme, the majority of occupational schemes, it's an all or nothing thing. I need to take all my cash today and then maybe buy an annuity. A lot of them don't have the flexibility. All you need to do an uncrystallised pensions funds lump sum. And again, the flexibility isn't necessarily there with the occupational schemes, even though that's what those were invented for. So I think it's definitely personal circumstance. What else have you got going on? Are you still working? If you're still working, then a little bit of tax-free cash to top it up, can be a real benefit, just to keep you out of the next tax band, which can, the total benefit of all of that is you pay less tax, you have to take less out, your money will last longer. And that's what we want from our pensions. We want our money to last longer. So I'm an advocate for advice. So I really think it's important that people get tax advice if they're not getting full financial advice. But looking at it in the round at all their other assets is really important, in my opinion.
Yep, that's a really good answer, Claire. Chris, can I come to you to add to that?
I'd echo all of that, but reinforce, particularly for the unadvised clients, the fact that retirement is not an all or nothing decision. And I say this because I talk to many individual people, not as clients, I'm not advising them, but just talking to friends, colleagues, and so on. There is an assumption in their mind that it is all or nothing. They've got this pension plan, and a magic day is going to come when they're going to drawing a pension from it. And they may well understand that they've got the choice of drawdown or annuity, but they think it's the whole fund going into drawdown at that point. So understanding that it can be phased over many, many years is the first thing. All Claire's points are absolutely right, including the point about tax allowances. And within that, I'd also say, talk about basic things like tax codes. When in the year are you doing this? Because if it is March and if it's April and you draw £20,000 out of your pot in a taxable way, you've got 1 month's tax allowance against that potentially. If you do it in the previous March, just a month earlier, you might have unused tax allowances, which will significantly reduce the amount of income tax. So simple things like that, which we're all used to. It's meat and drink to us. But for an end client, I think they need support in understanding this.
Yeah. Rennie, where do you think people are going to go to find this support?
Rennie's on mute.
You're on mute. I can unmute Rennie. Nope. Rennie, you're on mute, and I can't unmute you from my end.
Rennie, you should find the unmute button on your name if you hover over your name. But it's not working. We appear to have filled Rennie off.
Rennie, we are not doing too well with you, I'm afraid. We've got you stuck on mute at the moment. And if I full screen, it might unmute you. Nope.
Oh, it's gone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm now off mute. Sorry, apologies to everyone. There's obviously a few technical problems there. But yes, in terms of the support that people need in making their retirement decisions, well, we know about 8% of people actually take regulated advice. So that's an awful lot of people who are approaching retirement and actually going through retirement without receiving any sort of support or guidance at all. So, MAPS, or rebranded as Money Helper now, does a fantastic service. I think perhaps a problem there is it's only available to people from age 50. It would be nice if people earlier on in the retirement journey had an opportunity to receive some guidance as well. And if we think about if everybody actually took out guidance who's not receiving regulated advice, then would MAPS actually be able to cope with that sort of demand? Thinking we're in 2023 going to be launching the pensions dashboard. We're going to be providing all that information to consumers. A lot of that people will have seen only for the first time, and they'll probably be quite surprised one way or the other, what their sort of pension entitlements are. And I don't think as an industry, collectively with government, we can't provide that sort of information without providing an effective support framework to go alongside that. So very much in the camp that firms themselves and providers should be enabled to provide a bit more on the guidance side than they do now. All research shows that an element of personalisation with guidance resonates very well with individuals, and quite often, the provider is their first port of call, and then they just get told, no, we can't help you. The barrier between guidance and advice is very blurred, and typically firms will err on the side of caution to make sure they don't cross it. And you've then broken that journey and that engagement step because you're asking them to then go away and go somewhere else. So I think there needs to be some more work done on that guidance and advice boundary to enable consumers to have a wider option in getting some sort of personalised support.
That'd be really helpful. I think that lots and lots of people are worried about that boundary. Now, Rennie, as we got you back loud and clear at the moment, our next question is on the investment pathways and how do we stimulate greater take-up? I think when we lost you before, you were about to say something about investment pathways, and I suspect Tizer perhaps has been looking at how widespread they're being used.
Yes, indeed. Investment pathways. So that was what I was going to mention in my opening comments. But yes, so they came about in February, and when you dive down into the lower level of the actual requirements, it's quite clear that they don't perhaps meet the good intentions that were intended for traditional SIPP models. When you think about that, the idea for pathways is really to push people into thinking about not investing in cash and also providing a cash warning if they are in cash and in drawdown and they don't have an advisor. But typically with a SIPP member, they will be engaged with their savings and their investments. That's why they've taken out a SIPP. And they probably will be in cash for a while as well, because that's the nature of a SIPP and holding an element in cash. And some of those lower level requirements, especially when you bring in the additional investment manager into the mix as well, it makes some of these requirements really hard. It does look like trying to sort of fit a circle into a square peg at sometimes. In terms of the popularity of pathways, then we have got some early evidence, sort of 6 months on, that show that they really haven't been taken up much at all to date. So one of our members, actually AJ Bell, just this week released some figures saying they've had 1,700 people who have been taken through the journey of investment pathways, and only 4 people have actually taken them up. So that's quite an interesting stat, and that's not just AJ Bell are far from alone in that. There are certainly other firms that are experiencing quite low take up, so that might be of interest certainly to the FCA when they come to do their review. For those who do actually take out a pathway, then there is sort of a quite a standout option that is selected from all the others is option 1, which is I have no plans to touch my money in the next 5 years. And that's perhaps not surprising, because when you look at some of the FCA stats, out of those individuals who do enter drawdown and don't fully in cash, 65% of those actually only enter drawdown to access their tax-free cash and don't have any plans to touch their money. So perhaps nothing interesting there, but in terms of the take-up, it's certainly, you say it's disappointing. I'm not sure what people are doing with their money instead. I guess we will see when the official review comes out. But those are the figures that I have so far from initial discussions with our member firms.
That's really interesting, Rennie, and I think it's some clear pointers for us going forward there. As you said, we go back to why was it that the FCA introduced this in the first place? is that they had seen a number of customers, particularly in the non-advised space, who were really, really excited about getting their hands on the tax-free cash. I mean, that is the exciting bit of the pension. You can build a conservatory or buy a yacht or do something really good with it. But they were so excited about getting their hands on the tax-free cash that they didn't bother with stipulating any investment instructions for the rest of it, and the other 75% languished, in deposit accounts that are yielding incredibly little interest at the moment. So there's a good pointer there that those that are taking up the pathways are at least taking up a good one. And so they're remaining properly invested rather than in cash. There's a disappointment that so few people are following them. I wonder whether it's going to be like PensionWise. And when PensionWise started, it's a great service, by the way. I'm a huge fan of PensionWise. It had very, very low uptake. And, DWP have progressively lent on providers to do more and more to stimulate PensionWise. And indeed, they have consultation going through at the moment to do even more. So, quiet early days. I think as an industry, we'll need to do a lot more to get those investment pathways followed. Claire, thoughts?
I don't think it's a disappointment that the investment pathways haven't been taken up. I personally think it's a positive. If that many people have gone through the process with AJ Bell and then chosen to make their own decisions, that's what a SIPP is for. I personally think having 4 choices for how many was it, 1,400 people, then that's not personalised. So I'm not a big fan of the investment pathways myself. I think if you're going to go and self-invest, you should self-invest and take personalised advice. I know it's a good fallback, but actually I take the AJ Bell example as a positive, because they've looked through it and hopefully it's encouraged them to make decisions that are personalised to themselves rather than just tick a box. And I think that was my fear originally with the pathways, that people would see it as good advice or see it as advice. And This is something we raised directly with the FCA, that if you put down 4 options, they might think they're the 4 best options and they couldn't improve on that, which actually I think isn't the point. So I'm pleased with those results. I think that's a good thing.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go back onto the questions. I'm going to encourage the audience. We've got nearly 50 people live on our audience at the moment, but you're not voting for the questions. So please use that vote for a question facility, and then we'll make sure that we, answer the key ones that you would like to see answered. But I have one here that's got the most votes at the moment, which is asking us, how does the lifetime allowance work in terms of contribution limits and withdrawal limits and tax implications of those? Claire, I think that's a fairly technical one. I think it's referring to some of the points you were making in your introduction as well. So perhaps I could ask you to expand on those points around lifetime allowance.
No problem at all. I might just say I did vote that up, so that one vote was me. Just saying. So the lifetime allowance isn't driven by contributions. So it's not driven by what you're putting in. It's driven by your total pot, and that pot, depending on what type of scheme you're in. So if we're just going to focus on SIPPs, defined contributions, then it's the pot, all the investments, all the investment growth. And so it's how much is in there. So how much have you accrued in your lifetime, including all the great things, tax relief and everything in there. The way it's tested is at this point what we call crystallization. So it's the point that the easiest way to think about it is the point you take a bit of your tax-free cash. But as Chris said, and as we've discussed, you don't have to do that all in one go. And you take a little bit and you use a percentage of the lifetime allowance. So if you use 10% of the lifetime allowance, then you've got 90% of it remaining. And there's no lifetime allowance charges until you hit that magic 100%. So when you get to 100%, that's the point that you will start to incur lifetime allowance charges. You can choose not to crystallize any further, but you're going to come a cropper at 75 because you will be tested. So there's no avoiding age 75 unless you don't quite make it there. But at that point, the remainder of the uncrystallized pot, which is probably a notional thing. It's not necessarily 2 separate pots that are invested separately. And that's the point that you'll start incurring charges. I always call the lifetime allowance charge 25% because in its essence, it's 25%. And then dependent on what you do, it might be more. So if you crystallize it and you leave the remainder in your drawdown pot, then it's just 25%, and you'll pay income tax when you draw it out. If you actually say, I want it all now, give me all that excess now, then it's a 55% tax charge. But that's based on a 40% taxpayer. So if you're a 40% taxpayer and you were to crystallize it, put it into drawdown and draw it straight out, then it would still be equivalent to 55%. I'm not going to go through the numbers here, just believe me. If you're an additional rate taxpayer, then actually it's better to draw it out as a lump sum, because it's still always based on the 40% if you do it as a lump sum. So it's important to remember that you're not going to immediately have to pay a tax charge. The other thing to remember, and the thing that clients often forget, is you're not going to be sent a bill. You're not going to have to find this charge out of your own pocket. So in all circumstances in life, the lifetime allowance charge is taken from the scheme unless the scheme can't, and that's very few and far between. So it does happen if you've got just GMP, for example, but in most cases it will come directly from the scheme. The only circumstances that it's not payable by the scheme is on death, and if there is a charge on death, then it's paid by the beneficiary. But we don't worry about that too much, because the beneficiary will be inheriting basically a tax-free pot, and they'll be able to draw the money out in plenty of time in order to pay the tax charge, because it has to go around in a big circle with notifying different people, and HMRC eventually send them a bill. So it is something that I truly think people shouldn't fret about. It shouldn't be a driver for decision making. If you've got a lifetime allowance problem, then hopefully it's because you've made great investments. And that's a nice problem to have, and you've got a nice significant pension pot behind you to actually provide for you in your retirement, and possibly your beneficiaries and their beneficiaries, depending on how much money your family spends.
Thanks. Chris, if I could come to you on that, and in particular, I think the thing I'm interested in is the sort of degree of fairness of that 25%. My memory back in 2006 when it was introduced was that Treasury said it was simply clawing back the excess tax. I don't know whether you got a view as to whether it's a fair rate of clawback. If you're an advisor explaining to a client that you've got an extra 25% tax to pay, could you pass it off as fair, or are you going to have to sort of press up that, oh dear, we've run into tax problems? What's your view on an advisor facing up to a client about this extra tax?
I think in terms of the rate of tax, it's probably not unreasonable if you're going to have a lifetime allowance. That the issue I have is with the fact of a lifetime allowance and the level of the lifetime allowance. So it has been brought down. It was, I think, Claire, as much as 1.8 million at one point, and it's now down to 1 million or just over. So that, I think, is the real challenge. Separately, why do we have a lifetime allowance at all on pensions where there isn't one on ISAs? And there are plenty of people with 7-figure ISA funds now, I gather, with no sign of any cap on tax-free benefits which can come out of an ISA fund. So we may come on to talk about, and Claire has already touched on this actually in her opening comments, about blending all the different resources a client has to produce retirement income. I just find that disparity a little interesting and wonder whether that's going to be a potential target in the future. Rennie, you may have a comment on that.
My comment really, I guess if an advisor has got a client who's breached a lifetime allowance, I'd like to think the advisor has first considered taking out some sort of protection for their client, because we have had this reduction in the lifetime allowance, over a period of several years. We have got into quite a complicated world now with a number of different protections that are available and different restrictions that are attached to them as well if you have them, and getting them revoked and things, and falling back on another form of protection. So it's quite a minefield out there with the form of protections, especially considering we only had, 15 years ago now, I guess, the simplification, but we're making it very complicated again since then. The one thing about the lifetime allowance I'd like to say, which has sort of some press has been on this in recent days, is around the inequality between DB and DC. So for a person who's in DB, their lifetime allowance is measured by the actual annual income they receive. So they could actually, if the lifetime allowance was a nice round £1 million, they could receive an annual income with inflation protection and spouses protection of around £50,000 a year. If that same person was in a DC pot and had £1 million pension pot, then to get a sort of equivalent annuity of 50% spouses and a 3% or something increase, you're looking at around a £30,000 a year annual income. So there are huge discrepancies between the two there. But of course, it is quite controversial to look at because it will impact on the public sector and the MPs' pensions, which are of course DB.
Yes,
I have to say, I totally agree on that, and Chris will be well aware, as I've just written my master's dissertation on the exact topic. So I agree with you. Massive discrepancies there. Yeah. Sadly,
I don't think we're going to see any legislation changing those discrepancies soon. But I think they do remain a key factor for advisors to bear in mind of. So if you are one of the advisors that's still tiptoeing around inside the DB transfers marketplace, then undoubtedly the point Rennie is making here says that you could have a client with a DB scheme who is not caught by lifetime allowance, but if they take the transfer and put it into a SIPP, then they could be caught by the lifetime allowance. Another factor that they need to bear in mind. Moving on to our further questions. Our next question is a technology one, and it asks, can technology help SIPP holders to plan apologies, retirement decumulation journeys in line with income objectives?
You're suffering, Adrian. Shall I kick off on that? I'm a huge believer in technology. I think we need two things. Firstly, we need some decision support tools to help advisors understand the options available to them. So the idea of some kind of online journey tailored to a customer's individual circumstances, where they can enter in what they're looking for, what other resources they've got, and something which will lead them through the options and give them the implications of each option, I think is really powerful. But those decision support tools need to be underpinned with the ability to deliver on the ground the kind of flexibility which clients are looking for. So thinking about the process of actually beginning to draw benefits and moving from accumulation into decumulation. We've already talked about language and the need to find better language to describe this process. We need to look at how clients are taken through this process. The use of the words risk warnings. When you get a document with a panel of risk warnings, they might be nice bullet points, but the title risk warnings turns off any reader from looking at it. Just renaming it things you should think about is going to be really useful. If you put that into an online journey and provide tools to help them engage with that, that would be even more useful. Then moving on into the actual crystallization of part of a pot, how quickly can that happen? And when a client wants to draw money out, how quickly can it happen? I suspect that too many SIPP providers are still stuck on the old monthly payroll run. And if you ask to draw, £5,000 out of your SIPP today, if you just missed the cut-off date, you might have to wait 6 weeks for it. That's not what today's customers are expecting, particularly with the online SIPP offerings. They're expecting the fact that there's daily valuations there mean that if a client has already crystallized part of their fund, that the provider will be tracking the crystallized and the uncrystallized pot on a daily basis. And so if I, at 12:40, submit a form saying I'd like to draw £5,000 out of the pot, then with a 2 p.m. cut-off point, that gives time to check that A, I've got the crystallized fund, B, I've got enough crystallized fund to cover what I want to draw, C, that I've got enough cash in my pot to draw, so that at 3 o'clock there can be a payroll run, and by 4:30 the cash can be in my account this afternoon. Now, that may be a pipe dream for a great many providers, but I know that some are moving towards it, and some firms are making great progress. And So it's really great to see that, but we're going to need to put those kind of functions and tools around the journey if we're really going to engage clients and keep them on board. But fundamentally, they need those decision support tools to help lead them through the options, to understand the options, to understand the implications.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, those are really exciting timetables, and they almost sort of take us to the hole in the wall pension that was sort of much discussed in previous years. The idea you might have a plastic card and be able to put it into the bank machine in the bank wall, and money would come out.
I think that's still a way off. I remember talking with John Morey about that back in 1997, I think. That's still a way off. Let's at least get decent turnaround times and a decent online process for clients who have got funds, because as John has said, there is a wall of decumulation money coming through, and I think providers who are stuck in the old ways of thinking, the old ways of doing things, are going to see a lot of attrition to the firms who are geared up to provide the kind of functionality which modern clients are looking for.
Thanks. Rennie or Claire, either of you got any views as to what are the barriers that are sort of holding providers back from offering faster withdrawal services?
My opinion, a lot of it is actually the tax again. I mean, HMRC, once we get more real time, and I know we do a lot of real time tax, then it could definitely make it easier for providers, and we see things like emergency tax codes and clients not getting what they're expecting because everything sort of happens 2 or 3 days, after the payment's made. Then you discover the tax code's wrong and things like that. So I think there is a fear of paying out too much, and I think if we can be more confident in the tax system, then I think that will help. But again, it's, as Chris said, it's the platform providers that will be able to have this sort of facility. I can't imagine that happening when someone's got a commercial property sat there.
No. Rennie, you've worked in a technology company. What can you see coming technology-wise to help people through their retirement journeys?
Well, we see these online propositions, don't we, evolving now, as Chris is talking about, and I'm a big fan of technology. People get their annual statements and it will tell you what you might get at retirement, but it's a static document. We need some sort of dynamic planning that allows people to put in these what-if scenarios, so that at least they get an expectation of what their retirements might look like if they do this or if they do that. And if they don't want to do anything and they're on course for a rubbish retirement, well, at least they'll have an expectation that that's what they're going to get, and they can plan for that. So, I think as we're seeing this evolve, and with the dashboard as well, which can provide and embed links into a separate provider's own online proposition tools, I think these are exciting times. I would just caveat it with, though, we do need to be a little bit careful about how much people can actually transact online, because some of these decisions people will be making will be absolutely life-changing, involving huge sums of money. And so to be able to do things just at a touch of a button, despite the number of disclaimers and risk warnings you might have, we need to be very careful around that. And if you look at some research that comes out, quite often people will typically want some sort of human face-to-face just to validate their thinking before they actually go ahead and hit that button. So we still won't, I don't think, or shouldn't see a full online journey for absolutely everything. There needs to be some sort of protections put in place there. But the way it's going, excellent stuff, and it's the way forward.
Lovely. Right. Now, I'm going to move to a totally different subject, which is minimum retirement age. We've got a question coming in here. It's absolutely, on the button at the moment, because the government have been producing stuff on this. And our questioner asks, I want to retire at 55, but I know the normal minimum age is going up soon. What should I be looking for in my scheme's rules? This is a technical one. Who would like to?
I'll take that if you like, only because I've looked at the document, which some people might not have done. I think it's important. There's some great examples actually in the information provided by the government on this. And if your scheme rules basically say normal minimum pension age, then you don't have a guaranteed right to take it at 55. When it goes up, it's going to be 57, because that will be the normal minimum pension age. if it's hard and fast written into the rules that it's 55, or in some cases, and I think this is going to be the more likely scenario, if you've already got a protected pension age of 50 or possibly earlier, then that will remain. And I think we saw protected pension ages when it went up from 50 to 55. I know some schemes changed their rules to try and mitigate it happening again in the future, but I don't think the majority did, and they kept them as sort of the minimum pension age. So it's ask the question of your provider, because it won't necessarily just be provider specific, it will be scheme specific. It could even be job specific, dependent on what scheme you're in and things like that, and when you joined the scheme. So it's a hard one to answer, and the government hasn't set out hard and fast rules, as they very rarely do. So it's for the provider to take the view as to whether or not they have a guaranteed retirement age of 55, or if it's flexible and therefore 57. So yeah, back to the provider, unfortunately. Sorry, providers out there, but I think you're going to get a lot of these questions going forward.
I think you're right, they will do. Claire, is it too late for the providers to change their rules?
It is indeed. So when the consultation was issued, I think it was February, that's the cutoff. So it was, what were your scheme rules before that date? And that's what we have to look at.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Chris, I know you've worked with a number of providers on documentations on rules and things. Do you think this is going to be an easy question for providers to answer, or are they going to have to head off for their advisors and lawyers and whatnot?
I'm going to fess up and say that I've not actually looked at this in detail. So I've nothing really to add to what Claire has said, other than your point, you need to look at what rules said, and Claire's point that it is scheme specific and not provider specific.
Yep.
So, sorry, I can't add anything further.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep us moving on because the questions are coming in, and our most popular question at the moment is how can flexi retirees, the people that are perhaps still working part-time, avoid the dreaded money purchase annual allowance trap? It's a trap well worth avoiding, because if you fall into it, then you're very, very limited on how much more you can pay into a pension plan, down to no more than £4,000 a year. Reddy, can I come to you about what is it that flexi retirees need to do to avoid falling into the MPAA trap?
This is a really nice and simple one. It's just quite simply don't take any flexible income out of your pension, because as soon as you do, that triggers the money pension purchase annual allowance, which, as you say, is £4,000 a year. And when you consider a median earner of say £30,000 a year, which is probably just a little bit above median. But if they have a generous employer pension contribution into their AE scheme and they're totaling 13% or more, then they're going to be breaching that money purchase annual allowance. So I think it was originally intended just to sort of target some higher earners, but as we've seen earnings rise and that money purchase allowance stays static, and we've seen contribution levels rise as well. You know, a combination of those things we're seeing a lot more people going to be potentially impacted by this. So don't take your money out of your pension if you want to avoid the MPAA. Look to take it out of other sources first. But if you do happen to have a capped drawdown plan and you're in capped drawdown already, whereby you're restricted how much you can take out a year, if you don't need to exceed that cap, then by all means keep in that cap drawdown, and you can take money out of that without actually triggering the MPAA. It's only when you flexibly access it, which cap drawdown isn't, is when you're hit with this rather severe restriction.
Yeah, lovely. So taking the tax-free cash, okay. Taking the cap drawdown, okay. Taking flexible payments, yeah, lovely.
I think there's two rules of thumb that I always remember. Is one, is it a lump sum?
Yep.
And two, is it flexible? So if it's a lump sum, then you should be fine. If it's flexible, then it's a no. You know, and this is where the uncrystallised funds pension lump sum goes, because yes, it's a lump sum, so it should be fine, but it's a flexible payment. If it's is it a lump sum? No, but it's not flexible, so it's an annuity, so a non-flexible annuity, then again you're fine. So we have to remember annuities, as long as they're not able to decrease, then they are also fine. So it tends to be those two things that you're looking at to determine whether it is. Ask the provider if you're unsure, before you do anything, ask your provider because they will know.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Adrian, I don't know whether there are any FCA people on the call today, but if there is, can I just ask how on earth you would expect an ordinary consumer to understand any of this? The language we've been using, the terms we've been using are just things which an ordinary person, I think, are not going to engage with. So I do think there's a duty on a provider when somebody is asking to draw a benefit, which is not a lump sum or is flexible, then they need information in advance to understand the implications of doing that, expressed in terms which they'll understand.
I have to say the second line of defence sort of does that, but I don't think it does it in a particularly great way. So if you're unadvised and before you can trigger it, then they have to warn you. But I've known so many people, and we've seen so much in the press, haven't we, about people triggering the MPAA without having read those risk warnings, as they're known.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if someone wants their money, they just want their money, and they're not going to, any perceived obstacle that's put in their way, they're not going to really take notice of.
Yeah.
Now that brings us very nicely onto our next question, which is about drawing the money from other wrappers. And our questioner asks, on the holistic front, is there evidence of bonds, ISAs, and other tax wrappers, being linked to flexi retirement income management? And which of these options are people finding are proving popular, and why?
I'll pick that up again if you like.
Yes,
I mean,
please.
I think for the advised market, it definitely is, and I think that's where we see probably a fair big discrepancy. What Chris was saying earlier about people just taking their tax-free lump sum. With the advised market and with more focus on tools like cash flow planning and working out how the best way to extend your funds beyond your lifetime, which is what we're really looking at. There's definite progress in that area. But for the non-advised, then they may not necessarily have the capabilities to understand the withdrawal allowances from things like bonds, the taxation on things like unit trusts, and the lack of IHT flexibility in a lot of these products. Then I think it's probably not utilised enough. But it's very difficult for providers to actually help with that. And I think that's where we've got Money Helper, but is that going far enough to bring in all of those other issues, because it's guidance and it can't give advice. And once you start going, what other assets have you got? You're going to tip into advice, and it's going to become very risky. So I think there needs to be more help out there.
I think what we're also seeing, isn't it? We're seeing quite a spike in later life lending products at the moment. So, they used to have a bad name, probably for good reason, but there's been a lot of good work done in that area, and the number of flexible options that are available to people now, has increased significantly. We do see a lot of people taking these out for early inheritance to pass down to their children and grandchildren. But I think as we move more into a retirees of Generation DC, we're going to see more people needing to rely on the equity in their houses to fund their own retirements. So I would expect to see an ongoing increase in the number of people who take these products out, and perhaps also an increasing number of flexible options available.
Brilliant, lovely. Okay, let's keep it moving. And this one takes us into the issue of automated advice, or previously we used to be called robo-advice. Are we seeing evidence of robo-advice helping people here in the SIPP market as they're grappling with these retirement income decisions?
I would love to see evidence of it. I haven't myself seen any. I don't know whether Rennie or Claire have. So the robo things which I come across generally are around portfolio construction, kind of risk profiling and portfolio construction type tools, rather than leading somebody through this retirement process. So I'd love to see it. And if anybody on the call has got anything to suggest or contribute, please put a comment in the question box or in the comments box and let us know what we should be looking at.
I think the FCA are very interested in focusing on streamlined and restricted advice at the moment. And from speaking with some of our member firms, it's something that they would really like to be able to provide to their membership. The problem that exists at the moment is the requirements to set up restricted advice and the liabilities that firms would be on the hook for, exactly the same as offering a full advice proposition. And that's putting them off doing that. So there needs to be sort of a proportionate scale down in the requirements and liabilities that would exist for a provider of a restricted advice model. If that were achieved, then some of our member firms would certainly be looking to take up some of that and offer some of these propositions, which would include robo.
Excellent. Lovely. Brilliant. Now then, we've got a question coming up here. This is interesting. It's got a question and a counterpoint against it. So the questioner has asked, how best can the industry encourage direct SIPP holders not to cash out their pensions at retirement? And interestingly, we've got a counterpoint come in. Thank you very much. It's come from, Gareth James, who'll be known to many of you. Actually saying, well, is this behaviour widely seen in SIPP market at all? It's clearly not the experience at AJ Bell, where I believe Gareth works, where they see considerably more customers partially crystallise rather than fully. So I think we might sort of flip the question and say, what is it that we can do to encourage people to be taking partial crystallization where that would help them? Who would like to have a tackle at that one?
I would say, Adrian, it's all about sort of educating people. People will come to close to retirement and they receive their wake up pack or retirement pack, and they see a figure in front of them which is perhaps bigger than they thought, and far more than what they've got in the bank, and they just want to access that money straight away. If they actually went and got some regulated advice or had some sort of impartial guidance just to educate them a little bit about their options, that they don't have to take it all in one go. This might need to last you for your whole retirement, and you might not know how long that's going to be either. Well, you won't know how long that's going to be. It might cause people to actually just think a little bit more before actually just going ahead and making that decision. I think the problem is, once you've made that decision, we then have some interventions that are put in place, but it's a little bit too late because the horse has already bolted. And they're just perceived as obstacles and something that the pensions industry is putting in front of me, trying to block me from getting my money. They want to hold on to it as long as possible. So we need to overcome that with some education.
Now we're coming up to a time for our final question. It's quite an interesting one. Our final questioner is asking about how consumer behaviour might change post-pandemic. Obviously, some industries have seen, enormous changes with, sort of Amazon and Zoom, doing fantastically well as consumers change their behaviour. But when we talk to SIPPs, perhaps particularly how people will use SIPPs around retirement, how do we think that's going to be different post-pandemic to pre-pandemic? Who would like to tackle that one? Claire?
I just say, I think it depends. Again, we're back to this advised, non-advised area, because I think those people who've been taking advice through the pandemic are still doing what they were doing and doing it well. I think there's this fear of we saw changes in the stock market and things like that may drive different behaviour. So investing less because they want more ready access, because we've seen people who may have invested heavily into pensions who've then not been able to get their hands on them because they're not old enough and they needed the money in the bank to survive. So I think that it may drive a savings culture of a different way. So not saving for the long term, but having more ready cash. And I think that could be what we could see. And I think that with probably what we've seen in the short term with people cutting back on pension contributions, but I think they're picking up again now. But I think it's just by the by as people needed money and they didn't have it.
Yeah. Rennie, how do you think behaviour will change post-pandemic?
Well, it's great to see that through something awful as the pandemic, it has created for a certain group of people, and quite a large group of people, a group of savers who weren't savers before that, and so they've had a bit of spare cash, every month because they haven't been able to go out and spend it on the usual things. They put it into their bank. They're starting to see it grow. Hopefully, that's the start of a culture of saving. The problem we have now is all that money is just invested in cash. They don't understand about typically how to invest or where to invest, and you just think about the dangers of your money going down. So now we need to if you've got people now with the culture of saving, we need to help them understand where to put that money. Don't just hold it in a cash account if it's going to be something that you're going to be saving for and not touch for a period of years.
Thank you. And Chris, a final very quick comment on post-pandemic.
Just say that technology has proved its worth and people are becoming far more comfortable with it. I'd like to see more support facilities rolled out to SIPP users.
Yep, pension at home sounds as good as working at home, doesn't it? It's well, that's all we've got time for today. I hope that you've enjoyed the last hour, during which I reckon the SIPP market grew by another £140,000, plus of course any investment returns that we've enjoyed during that time if FTSE's been up. Here at Dunstan Thomas, we'll be back in September with the next in this series of Dunstan Thomas webinars. So keep your eyes peeled for the mailer and giving you notice of what it is, when it is, and who our panelists will be in September. Meanwhile, all that is left for me to do is to thank today's panelists, Chris Jones, Claire Trott, and Rennie Biggins. So a big thank you to you for your contributions, and to thank you, our audience, for spending your lunch hour with us today. Goodbye.